The $25,000 marble kitchen looked like a war zone. Hand-imported Italian pasta scattered across heated floors like expensive confetti. Truffle oil worth more than most people's cars pooled around overturned copper pots that had been crafted by French artisans. 5 identical 6-year-old boys stood in perfect formation among the wreckage, their matching school blazers splattered with chocolate ganache and tomato sauce. But here's what nobody expected to see in their faces. Not joy. Not mischief. Not the wild satisfaction of successful destruction. Instead, their dark eyes held something much heavier. Exhaustion. The kind that comes from screaming into a void that never answers back. Theodore Ashford had fired 10 professional cooks in 30 days. 10 trained adults who walked into this kitchen confident in their abilities to tame difficult children. 10 people who fled within hours, some within minutes, all carrying the same complaint: those boys are impossible to control. Then Isabella Romano stepped through that doorway. The destruction didn't make her flinch. The mess didn't make her gasp. The 5 sets of challenging eyes staring up at her didn't make her turn around and walk back out like everyone else had done. Instead, she surveyed the chaos with the calm of someone who had seen worse. Someone who understood what everyone else had missed. She looked directly at Gabriel, Daniel, Nathan, Lucas, and Ethan. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. 2 words that would change everything: clean it up. Before we show you how one woman's quiet command transformed 5 broken hearts forever, understand this. We spend months researching child psychology, family trauma, and healing patterns to bring you stories that matter. Stories that see the pain behind the behavior. If content that heals instead of just entertains matters to you, this channel needs your support. Why her? What did Isabella Romano see that 10 professional cooks missed? What happened in those first 30 seconds that turned destroyers into listeners? This story is part of our SoulThread Stories collection. Fiction inspired by the healing that happens when someone finally sees the person behind the problem. If you want access to our complete collection of transformational stories, drop SoulThread in the comments below. But to understand why Isabella Romano's 2 words had the power to stop 5 destructive children in their tracks, you need to know about the graveyard that came before her. 10 professional cooks. 30 days. Each departure more devastating than the last. Cook number 1 lasted exactly 4 hours. Margaret Chen had 20 years of experience in high-end households, references from celebrities, and a reputation for handling the most demanding clients. She walked out on a Tuesday afternoon with mashed potatoes in her hair and defeat in her eyes. "Mr. Ashford," she said, clutching her designer purse, "your children need therapy, not a cook." Cook number 2 made it through 1 breakfast service. James Rodriguez had worked for tech executives, oil tycoons, and European royalty. He quit after finding his grandmother's recipe cards floating in the pool, sodden and ruined. "Those boys," he whispered to Theodore's assistant, "they're not just misbehaving, they're at war." By cook number 3, word was getting around. Anna Petrov lasted 6 days, longer than anyone expected. She was Russian, had survived economic collapse, raised 4 children of her own. But she broke down crying in the staff quarters after Gabriel, the apparent leader, looked her straight in the eye and asked, "Are you going to leave us too?" She packed that night. Cook number 4 never made it past the interview. David Kim took one look at the kitchen's reinforced surfaces, installed after repeated damages, and politely declined. Cook number 5 lasted 2 hours. Cook number 6 made it through lunch but fled after Nathan, the quiet one, stood in the doorway and watched her cook with the intensity of someone memorizing her face for after she was gone. French chef Marcel Baptiste thought he was different. He had trained at Le Cordon Bleu, worked in Michelin-starred restaurants, handled temperamental celebrity clients. He lasted 3 days. His final morning, all 5 boys coordinated their attack with military precision. While he was focused on Lucas creating a distraction near the stove, the other 4 systematically destroyed a soufflé that had taken him 2 hours to prepare. Marcel found flower handprints on his designer jacket and his spirit completely broken. "Monsieur Ashford," he said in accented English, "these children, they do not want food. They want something I cannot give." And where was Theodore Ashford through all of this chaos? The man who had built a $3 billion empire from a college dorm room, who could negotiate hostile takeovers and navigate complex international markets, was hiding in his home office like a prisoner in his own mansion. Every morning at exactly 6:30, Theodore would slip down the back staircase to the kitchen, pour coffee from a machine he kept on the counter specifically to avoid interaction, and disappear back upstairs before any of the boys woke up. His assistant handled all communication with household staff. His driver picked up the children for school. His accountant paid for the damages. But Theodore himself? He hadn't set foot in the family wing of the house for over 2 years. The children knew this. Oh, they absolutely knew this. From their bedroom windows on the 2nd floor, Gabriel, Daniel, Nathan, Lucas, and Ethan would position themselves like tiny sentries, watching each new cook arrive with their suitcases and their confidence and their hope of lasting longer than the person before them. The boys had learned to read the signs, which adults would try to bribe them with treats, which ones would attempt stern authority, which ones would break down and beg. They had become experts at adult behavior patterns because their survival depended on it. Then Isabella Romano walked into Theodore's office for an interview that would change everything. She didn't ask about salary ranges or vacation time. She didn't request a detailed list of food allergies or dietary restrictions. Instead, she asked questions that cut straight through Theodore's carefully constructed business language. How long has it been since you've eaten a meal with your children? Theodore's hands stilled on his mahogany desk. My schedule is quite demanding. When did the destructive behavior start? Shortly after their mother. He couldn't finish the sentence. Isabella leaned forward, her dark eyes gentle but unwavering. "Mr. Ashford, your children aren't trying to drive away household staff. They're trying to get your attention." 10 adults had walked away from 5 grieving children. 10 professionals chose their own comfort over broken hearts that needed healing. How many times do we do the same in our own lives? Skip past the difficult conversations, avoid the messy emotions, choose easy over necessary? If you've ever felt like giving up on someone who needed you most, this story is for you. Hit that like button if you're still here, still listening, still believing that broken things can be repaired. What did Isabella see in that interview that made her take a job 10 people had quit? Why didn't the children's reputation scare her away? While other candidates had shaking hands and nervous energy, Isabella Romano sat perfectly calm. While others focused on containing the children's behavior, she was already thinking about healing their hearts. While others saw 5 impossible children, she saw 5 little boys who had learned that destroying things was the only way to keep adults in the room long enough to really look at them. Money can't buy emotional healing. Wealth can't purchase genuine connection. Sometimes the most expensive problems require the simplest solutions, someone who stays. Theodore hired Isabella Romano that afternoon, not because he believed she would succeed, but because she was the first person who didn't promise to fix his children. Instead, she promised to understand them. The boys watched from their window as she carried her single suitcase up the front steps. They had no idea that this woman was about to change their lives forever. They had no idea that someone had finally arrived who wouldn't run away when things got difficult. They had no idea that Isabella Romano had spent the last 5 years learning how to love children that other people had given up on. Comment hope if you believe that someone, somewhere, is waiting for the right person to finally see past their pain to their potential. Subscribe now, because this story is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what happens when unstoppable love meets unbearable grief. Isabella Romano's first morning in the Ashford mansion began at 5:45 a.m., not because she was an early riser, but because she could hear movement upstairs. Whispered conversations. Footsteps crossing hardwood floors with the careful coordination of a military operation. The quintuplets were planning something. From the kitchen window, she watched the sunrise paint the manicured gardens in soft gold light while she made her coffee. By 6:15, she could hear them positioning themselves upstairs. By 6:30, when their father would normally make his stealth coffee run, 5 sets of feet were moving in formation down the hallway. But Theodore didn't appear that morning. For the first time in 2 years, his routine was broken. He was hiding deeper in his office, afraid to witness what was about to happen to his newest hire. At exactly 7 a.m., Gabriel, Daniel, Nathan, Lucas, and Ethan filed into the kitchen like soldiers reporting for duty. They were dressed in their private school uniforms, navy blazers, crisp white shirts, perfectly knotted ties. But their eyes held the calculating intelligence of generals preparing for war. Isabella turned from the counter where she'd been quietly preparing breakfast and smiled at them. "Good morning." They didn't respond. Instead, they fanned out across the kitchen with practiced precision. Gabriel took position near the refrigerator. Daniel moved to the pantry. Nathan stationed himself by the stove. Lucas and Ethan flanked the central island like bookends. This was it. The ultimate test. The moment that had broken 10 adults before her. What happened next would be burned into Isabella Romano's memory forever, not because of the destruction, but because of what she saw in their faces while they destroyed everything around her. Gabriel opened the refrigerator and began systematically removing items. Organic milk, free-range eggs, artisanal cheeses worth more per pound than most people's hourly wage. He didn't throw them. He placed each item carefully on the floor, maintaining direct eye contact with Isabella the entire time. Daniel moved to the pantry and retrieved the truffle oil. The same expensive bottles that had been weapons in countless battles before. He unscrewed the cap with deliberate precision, never breaking eye contact, and began pouring black liquid across the white marble countertops in slow, steady streams. Nathan, the quietest one, the one who rarely spoke to anyone, climbed onto a chair and reached for the hand-imported pasta that lived in crystal containers on the highest shelves. He didn't grab handfuls and throw them wildly like a child having a tantrum. Instead, he opened each container methodically and sprinkled the contents across the floor like expensive snow. Lucas and Ethan worked together, removing pots and pans from the custom cabinets and placing them strategically around the room. Not banging them. Not creating noise that would summon adults to intervene. Just repositioning them in ways that would require significant effort to undo. Through it all, 5 pairs of identical dark eyes never left Isabella's face. They were watching for the moment she would break. The moment she would start yelling. The moment she would throw up her hands and storm out like everyone else had done. But Isabella Romano stood perfectly still. Truffle oil pooled around her expensive shoes, and she didn't move. Pasta crunched under her feet, and she didn't flinch. When Gabriel deliberately knocked over a container of saffron worth more than most people's car payments, she simply watched it scatter across the floor like golden dust. The children began to slow their movements. This wasn't going according to their carefully practiced plan. Where was the shouting? Where were the threats? Where was the moment when the adult would reveal their true nature and abandon them like all the others? When the last piece of imported cheese hit the marble floor, the kitchen fell completely silent. Isabella looked around at the destruction, then back at 5 confused, exhausted little faces. She took a deep breath, and in a voice as calm as still water, spoke the 2 words that would change everything. Clean it up. The effect was immediate and shocking. Gabriel's mouth fell open. Daniel actually stepped backward. Nathan's eyes went wide with something that looked like relief. Lucas and Ethan grabbed each other's hands instinctively. But the most shocking reaction came from the doorway, where Theodore Ashford stood with his hand pressed over his mouth, witnessing something he had never seen in his own home, his children actually listening to an adult. Isabella didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't beg or bargain or flee like the others. She simply expected better and waited for them to rise to that expectation. When's the last time someone believed in you enough to hold you accountable instead of making excuses for you? That kind of love is rare. That kind of content is rarer. The boys began to move. Not quickly, not enthusiastically, but they began to clean. Gabriel started picking up the cheese. Daniel reached for paper towels to address the oil spills. Nathan climbed down from his chair and began collecting pasta pieces. Lucas and Ethan started returning pots to their proper places. They moved like robots, testing whether Isabella would really stay, whether she would really watch them undo their masterpiece of destruction without getting angry or giving up. For 45 minutes, she stood in that kitchen and supervised the cleanup without saying another word. When Theodore's white knuckles finally released their grip on the doorframe and he retreated back to his office, Isabella was still there. When the school transport honked outside and the boys had to leave for classes, their kitchen was restored to pristine condition. But the real test came that evening. Bedtime in the Ashford house had been a war zone for 2 years. 5 children who refused to follow routine, who stayed up until they collapsed from exhaustion, who treated every boundary like a personal challenge to overcome. At 8 p.m. sharp, Isabella appeared in the family wing carrying 5 cups of warm milk and honey. "Bedtime," she announced simply. "We don't have bedtimes," Gabriel said, testing her authority. "Tonight you do," Isabella replied. "We don't drink warm milk," Daniel added. "Tonight you will," she said, offering him a cup. For an hour, they tested every boundary she set. They claimed they needed water, then bathroom breaks, then couldn't find their pajamas, then suddenly remembered homework that absolutely had to be completed immediately. Isabella Romano met every excuse with the same calm consistency. Water was provided, bathroom breaks were supervised, pajamas were located, homework was acknowledged but postponed until morning. How did 2 words accomplish what months of therapy, punishment, and bribery couldn't? What was different about the way she said it? By 9:15 p.m., 5 exhausted little boys were tucked into their beds. By 9:30, the house was quiet for the first time in 2 years. By 10 o'clock, Theodore Ashford was standing outside the family wing, listening to the sound of his children sleeping peacefully, wondering if he was witnessing a miracle or simply good parenting. This moment proves what child psychology teaches. Children don't want chaos. They want adults strong enough to create safety through consistent boundaries. The boys had spent 2 years trying to drive adults away, but what they really needed was someone strong enough to stay. Someone who could see through their destructive behavior to the broken hearts underneath. Someone who understood that sometimes the loudest cry for help sounds like an attack. Share this story if you've ever needed someone who refused to give up on you when you were at your worst. Comment, boundaries, if you understand that love sometimes looks like limits, not limitless permission. Subscribe because tomorrow will show you what happened when these 5 little boys finally felt safe enough to let their guard down. Isabella Romano had passed their first test. But she had no idea that the real challenge was just beginning. 3 days into Isabella Romano's employment, the Ashford mansion learned the difference between quiet and peace. The boys were following her boundaries, eating meals at designated times, completing their homework without major incidents. But at 3:17 in the morning on Thursday, the fragile calm shattered. Gabriel's scream ripped through the silence like a blade through silk. It wasn't the cry of a child having a bad dream. This was the sound of a 6-year-old's heart breaking in real time, raw and primal and desperate. "Mommy! Mommy, where are you?" In most households, this would have brought parents running. In the Ashford mansion, it brought no one. The night staff had learned to ignore these episodes. They happened twice a week, sometimes more. Theodore's standing instructions were clear: do not intervene unless there was physical danger. The children would eventually cry themselves back to sleep, and morning would bring the blessed amnesia of routine. But Isabella Romano wasn't most people. She was out of bed and moving before Gabriel's second scream echoed through the hallways. Her bare feet were silent on the marble floors as she navigated the family wing, following the sound of a little boy's unbearable grief. She found Gabriel thrashing in his bed, tangled in sheets that cost more than most people's monthly rent, his small body shaking with sobs that seemed too big for his 6-year-old frame. His eyes were wide open, but he wasn't seeing the luxury bedroom around him. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere his mother should have been but wasn't. "Gabriel," Isabella said softly, not touching him yet, knowing that startling a child in the grip of a night terror could make everything worse. His dark eyes focused on her face, confusion mixing with desperate hope. "Where's my mom? She was just here. She was right here, and then..." His voice broke completely. Isabella sank down onto the floor beside his bed, positioning herself at his eye level. "She's not here, sweetheart. But I am. I want my mom," Gabriel whispered, the fight going out of him all at once. "I know you do," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was breaking for this little boy. "Tell me about her." And Gabriel did. For the next 4 hours, until the sky began to lighten outside his bedroom window, he talked about a mother he barely remembered but loved with the intensity of someone trying to hold on to smoke. He told Isabella about her laugh, which he could only recall in fragments. About her perfume, which he thought maybe smelled like flowers but wasn't sure. About bedtime stories she used to read, though he couldn't remember the words anymore. Isabella sat on that bedroom floor through all of it, her back against the wall, her presence steady and unwavering while Gabriel grieved for a mother who had died bringing him and his brothers into the world. When dawn finally crept through the expensive curtains, Gabriel's breathing had evened out, exhaustion finally claiming him. Isabella remained exactly where she was, watching his chest rise and fall, her silhouette framed against the window light like a guardian angel who had traded wings for patience. She was still there when the other boys woke up. Daniel found her first, creeping down the hallway in his pajamas, probably planning some early morning mischief. Instead, he discovered Isabella asleep sitting up against Gabriel's wall, her hand resting protectively near his brother's bed. Something shifted in Daniel's expression. Something that looked almost like wonder. Breakfast that morning was different. Not because the boys behaved perfectly, they didn't. They still tested Isabella with impossible demands. Lucas insisted he could only eat cereal if the milk was exactly room temperature. Ethan claimed he needed his toast cut into perfect triangles, not squares. Nathan sat silently counting his cereal pieces, arranging them in patterns that made sense only to him. But Gabriel looked at Isabella differently now. Like someone who had been seen in his darkest moment and hadn't been found wanting. After breakfast, while the boys played in the backyard under the supervision of their tutor, Isabella began exploring the parts of the house that weren't part of her official duties. She wasn't snooping, she was trying to understand. How does a family function when grief has carved out the center of their world? That's when she found the fort. It was tucked away in a storage room on the 3rd floor, built from expensive furniture covered with childhood blankets and held together with the kind of engineering that only children possess. At first glance, it looked like a normal hideout. But as Isabella crouched down to peer inside, she discovered something that explained everything. Hidden under layers of dusty blankets were dozens of photograph frames. Pictures of a woman with dark hair and gentle eyes, surrounded by infant quintuplets in hospital blankets. A woman holding 5 babies with the exhausted joy of someone who had fought to bring them safely into the world. A woman who would never see them take their first steps, speak their first words, or need comfort during their first nightmares. The boys had created a shrine to their mother in secret, hidden away like contraband. Isabella was still crouched there, holding a photo of Lydia Ashford reading to her newborn sons, when Daniel found her. "Put that down." His voice cracked like a whip through the quiet room. Isabella looked up to find Daniel standing in the doorway, his face transformed by rage so pure it was frightening. "Daniel, I was just... Don't touch her." He lunged forward and snatched the frame from Isabella's hands with white-knuckled desperation. "You don't get to touch her. Nobody gets to touch her." In his fury, Daniel's grip on the frame slipped. The glass shattered against the hardwood floor, and suddenly he was standing there holding the broken pieces of his mother's memory, his chest heaving with the kind of grief that has nowhere to go. Isabella spent the whole night on a 6-year-old's bedroom floor because she understood something crucial. Healing happens in the dark hours when no one's watching. When comfort isn't convenient. When love costs sleep, time, and pieces of your own heart. That's the kind of commitment we bring to every story we craft for you. "I'm sorry," Isabella said quietly, not moving toward him, understanding that Daniel needed space to hold his pain. "She's ours," Daniel whispered, tears streaming down his face as he clutched the broken frame. "She's all we have left, and everyone wants to take her away." That's when Isabella understood. The photos weren't hidden from burglars or household staff. They were hidden from Theodore. This family hadn't just lost a mother and wife, they had lost the right to grieve her openly. Why were the mother's photos hidden? What was this family so afraid of remembering? And why did one child's nightmare break through Isabella's professional boundaries? The answer was becoming heartbreakingly clear. Theodore Ashford hadn't just abandoned his children after his wife's death. He had made it impossible for them to remember her without feeling like they were betraying his pain. Grief doesn't follow schedules. Healing doesn't happen during business hours. Sometimes love looks like staying awake when everyone else sleeps. Comment, remember, if you've ever had to hide your grief to protect someone else's feelings. Share this story if you know someone who's been forced to mourn in silence. Subscribe because these 5 little boys were about to teach their father something he desperately needed to learn, that remembering the dead doesn't dishonor them, forgetting them does. The cracks in the Ashford family's armor were finally showing, and Isabella Romano was about to discover just how deep those fractures ran. Isabella Romano had been living in the Ashford mansion for exactly 2 weeks when she discovered something that broke her heart in a completely different way than anything she'd experienced so far. It wasn't Gabriel's nightmares or Daniel's protective rage over his mother's memory. It was the systematic, calculated way 5-6-year-old boys decided to destroy the only pieces of home she had brought with her. She came back from grocery shopping that Tuesday afternoon to find her bedroom door standing wide open. That was her first warning sign. She always kept it closed. Her second warning was the complete silence from the family wing. In her experience with the quintuplets, silence was never a good thing. What she found inside her room took her breath away. Her suitcase had been opened and emptied, contents scattered across the hardwood floor like evidence of a crime. But they hadn't just dumped her belongings. They had been methodical, selective. They had gone straight for the things that mattered most. The framed photograph of her parents, taken on their 25th wedding anniversary, lay on the floor with the glass shattered and their faces carefully torn out of the frame. Her mother's rosary beads, the ones Isabella had carried through 3 deployments and 2 cross-country moves, were tangled around a chair leg like discarded jewelry. The handwritten recipe cards her grandmother had left her, the only inheritance she'd received, were scattered near the window, some torn in half. But the worst discovery was her father's military dog tags. The ones she'd worn around her neck since his funeral 8 years ago. They were sitting on her bedside table, deliberately placed where she couldn't miss them, with a single word scratched into the metal surface. Leave. Isabella sank onto her bed and stared at the destruction surrounding her. For the first time since arriving at the Ashford mansion, she felt tears building behind her eyes. Not because of the monetary value of what had been destroyed. None of it was worth much money. But because these were the only physical connections she had to people who had loved her unconditionally. The boys had found her most vulnerable spot and attacked it with surgical precision. We thought you might want to pack now. Gabriel's voice came from the doorway, steady and matter-of-fact. Behind him stood Daniel, Nathan, Lucas, and Ethan in their usual formation, watching her reaction with the intensity of scientists observing an experiment. Isabella looked up at them, and for the first time since she'd arrived, they saw something they'd never seen before, genuine anger in her eyes. You think this is going to make me leave? Her voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath the calm surface. It's worked before, Daniel said, his chin raised defiantly. Isabella stood up slowly, her hands shaking as she picked up the torn pieces of her parents' photograph. This was the last picture I had of my mother and father together. They died in a car accident when I was 15, and I've carried this photo with me for 13 years. The boys' confident expressions began to waver slightly. Isabella held up her grandmother's torn recipe cards. These belonged to the woman who raised me after my parents died. She taught me how to make her famous chocolate chip cookies using these exact cards. She passed away last Christmas, and these were all I had left of her voice, her handwriting, her love. Lucas and Ethan exchanged uncertain glances. Isabella picked up her father's damaged dog tags, running her thumb over the scratched metal. And these belonged to Staff Sergeant Michael Romano, who served 3 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to raise his daughter with the kind of strength and dignity you boys haven't seen in your own home for 2 years. That's when Nathan stepped forward. Nathan, who hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since his mother's funeral. Nathan, who communicated through looks and silence and careful observation. Nathan, whose voice was so rarely heard that even his brothers turned to stare when he opened his mouth. We make them leave before they can leave us, he whispered, his huge dark eyes filling with tears. It's easier when we choose. It hurts less when it's our fault. The room fell completely silent. Isabella felt her anger dissolve like sugar in water. She knelt down so she was at Nathan's eye level, still holding the pieces of her broken life in her hands. Nathan, she said gently, how long have you been planning this? Since the day you came, he answered, his voice gaining strength. We watched you be nice to Gabriel when he had nightmares. We watched you not get mad when Daniel broke Mom's picture frame. We watched you clean up our messes and make us food and tuck us in at night, and we knew. Knew what, sweetheart? We knew we were going to love you, Nathan said, tears now streaming down his face. And we knew that meant you were going to leave us too. Everyone who loves us leaves us. Nathan hadn't spoken in 2 years. 2 years of silence because he learned that words hurt people and people leave. But Isabella stayed through his worst test. She got angry, she got hurt, but she didn't get gone. How many of us need someone who stays through our worst tests? How many times have we walked away when someone's pain looked like an attack? Isabella set down the broken pieces of her past and opened her arms. Nathan fell into them like a child who had been holding his breath for 2 years and could finally exhale. But their moment was interrupted by slow, deliberate clapping from the hallway. Theodore Ashford stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold disapproval. "Quite a performance," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is this how you plan to handle discipline in my household? Through emotional manipulation?" Isabella looked up at him, still holding Nathan, and something clicked into place. "How long have you been watching?" Theodore's expression flickered for just a moment. "I happened to be passing by." "No," Isabella said, standing up but keeping Nathan close to her side. "How long have you been watching? Really watching?" That's when she noticed them. Small, black cameras mounted in the corners of the room, so discreet they were nearly invisible. Professional-grade surveillance equipment. "You've been watching your children through cameras," Isabella said, the pieces finally falling into place. "You've been monitoring their every move, their every breakdown, their every desperate attempt to get your attention, and you've done nothing." The other boys formed a protective circle around Isabella and Nathan, facing their father with a unity they'd never shown before. "You watch them destroy things and hurt people and cry themselves to sleep," Isabella continued, her voice rising. "But you've never once walked into their rooms. Never once held them while they grieved. Never once told them it's okay to miss their mother." Why did Nathan finally break his silence? What did Isabella do differently when they hurt her? How long had Theodore been watching instead of parenting? Theodore Ashford, billionaire CEO, master of hostile takeovers, was being challenged by 5-6-year-olds and a 28-year-old woman who had just proven something he'd never learned. That love isn't about watching from a safe distance. It's about staying close enough to get hurt and choosing to stay anyway. Trust isn't built through perfection. It's built through staying when someone's pain makes them dangerous to love. Comment, "Stay," if you've ever needed someone who wouldn't leave when you were at your worst. Share this story if you know someone who's been afraid to love because they've learned that love always ends in loss. Subscribe because these 5 little boys were about to teach their father the difference between protection and presence. The trust test was far from over. The confrontation in Isabella's destroyed bedroom had shattered something fundamental in the Ashford family dynamics. For the first time in 2 years, Theodore found himself face to face with 5 children who were defending someone else instead of destroying everything around them. For the first time in 2 years, his sons were looking at him with disappointment instead of fear. And for the first time since his wife's funeral, Theodore Ashford realized he might have been wrong about everything. "We need to have a family meeting," Isabella said the next morning, her voice calm but carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "All of us. Kitchen table. Right now." Theodore opened his mouth to object. He had conference calls, board meetings, a company to run, but stopped when he saw the way his children were looking at him. Like they were finally ready to tell him truths he might not want to hear. They arranged themselves around the breakfast table in the kitchen that had been a battlefield for so long. Isabella sat between Nathan and Lucas. Theodore took the chair across from Gabriel, Daniel, and Ethan. For the first time in their lives, they were all at the same eye level, no one standing, no one hiding, no one running away. "I want everyone to tell the truth," Isabella said simply. "No matter how much it hurts. No matter how scary it feels. We're going to say the things we've been too afraid to say." Gabriel, as always, spoke first. We made the cooks leave on purpose. Theodore's eyes widened. What? All of them, Daniel added, his chin raised with defiant honesty. We studied them first. Figured out what would make them quit fastest. Margaret Chen was scared of messes, so we made big ones. James Rodriguez cared about fancy food, so we destroyed expensive ingredients. Anna Petrov had kids of her own, so we asked her if she was going to abandon us too. We're really good at making adults go away, Lucas said quietly. Why? Theodore asked, though his voice came out as barely a whisper. Because, Ethan answered, it's easier when we choose. When people leave because we're bad instead of because we're not worth staying for. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of expensive appliances and the sound of Theodore Ashford's world shifting on its axis. Your turn, Dad, Gabriel said, using a word he hadn't spoken in over a year. Theodore looked at his 5 sons, really looked at them, and saw his wife's eyes staring back at him from 5 different faces. The same dark eyes that had closed forever in a hospital room while he held her hand and promised to take care of their babies. I've been hiding from you, he said, his voice breaking. I've been hiding from you because every time I look at you, I see her. And seeing her means remembering that she's gone, and remembering that she's gone means facing the fact that it's my fault. How is it your fault? Nathan asked, speaking up for the second time in 2 years. Because I'm the one who wanted another baby, Theodore whispered. Your mother was happy with your older sister. But I wanted more children. I pushed for fertility treatments. I insisted we keep trying even when the doctors said it was risky. And when she died bringing you 5 into the world. He couldn't finish the sentence. Isabella reached across the table and placed her hand gently on Theodore's. She chose to have those babies. She chose to fight for their lives even when it cost her own. That's not your fault. That's her love. I don't know how to be your father, Theodore continued, tears streaming down his face. I don't know how to love you without betraying her memory. I don't know how to be present for you when being present means accepting that she's never coming back. Gabriel stood up from his chair and walked around the table. Without a word, he climbed into his father's lap for the first time since his mother's funeral. We miss her too, Daddy, Gabriel whispered against his father's shoulder. We miss Mommy and we miss you. When Gabriel finally felt safe enough to tell his father, I miss Mommy and I miss you, there wasn't a dry eye in that kitchen. These weren't just characters in our story. They were every family that's learned to survive apart instead of heal together. We craft these stories because someone needs to see their own pain reflected and their own strength recognized. One by one, the other boys joined them. Daniel wrapped his arms around his father's neck. Nathan pressed his face against Theodore's chest. Lucas and Ethan flanked them on either side, creating a huddle of grief and forgiveness that had been 2 years in the making. I want to learn, Theodore said into Gabriel's hair. I want to learn how to be your dad without forgetting your mom. Isabella wiped tears from her own cheeks and stood up. Then let's start with lunch. Your wife's favorite recipe. The one the boys found in their secret fort. For the next 2 hours, the Ashford kitchen transformed from a battlefield into something it had never been before, a place of healing. Isabella guided Theodore and his sons through the process of making Lydia's famous chicken and dumplings, the recipe she had perfected during her pregnancy and planned to teach her children when they were old enough. Theodore's hands shook as he measured flour. Gabriel stood on a step stool, carefully stirring the broth. Daniel added vegetables with the precision of someone handling precious treasure. What recipe could bring a broken family together? How do you cook through tears and still create something nourishing? Nathan quietly narrated each step, his voice growing stronger with every instruction. Lucas and Ethan took turns reading ingredients from their mother's handwritten recipe card, her careful script connecting past to present like a bridge across grief. When flour got spilled, they laughed instead of panicking. When Daniel accidentally dropped an entire onion into the pot, Theodore smiled, his first real smile in 2 years, and helped him fish it out. When the kitchen timer finally rang, marking the completion of their first family dinner in 24 months, they had created more than just a meal. They had created a new way of being together. That evening, Theodore tucked his sons into bed for the first time since their mother's death. He read them a story, answered their questions about why their mother couldn't come back, and promised them something he should have promised 2 years earlier, that he would learn to be present for their pain instead of hiding from it. When Isabella found him later that night, standing outside their bedroom doors and listening to the sound of peaceful sleep, she saw something different in his face. "How do I make up for 2 years of hiding?" he asked her. "You don't," Isabella said simply. "You just start showing up now. Every day. Even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." Healing happens around kitchen tables and in ordinary moments when extraordinary love shows up consistently. Share this story if you know someone who's been afraid to grieve because they thought mourning meant forgetting. Comment "present" if you're ready to show up for someone's pain instead of hiding from it. Subscribe because this family's journey is just beginning, and what happens next will show you that love doesn't end with death, it just learns to exist in new forms. The Ashford family had finally learned the difference between surviving grief and healing through it. 6 months after Isabella Romano first walked into the Ashford mansion, the kitchen looked like a completely different kind of war zone. Flour dusted the marble countertops, but it was there because Gabriel had been teaching his father how to make pasta from scratch. Chocolate chips were scattered across the floor, but they had fallen there during Lucas and Ethan's attempt to break their mother's cookie baking record. The sink was full of dishes, but they were dirty because 6 people had sat down together for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day for the past month. The chaos was still there, but it was the chaos of a family living together, not destroying each other. Theodore Ashford stood in the doorway of his kitchen on a Tuesday morning in March, watching his sons pack their lunches with Isabella's guidance, and marveled at how different his life looked. Gabriel was carefully spreading peanut butter on whole wheat bread, explaining to Nathan why crunchy was superior to smooth. Daniel was arguing with Lucas about whether apples or oranges were better fruit choices. Ethan was drawing hearts on the paper lunch bags with colored markers. They looked like normal children having normal sibling disagreements about normal things. "Dad, can you sign my field trip permission slip?" Gabriel asked, looking up from his sandwich construction. Theodore accepted the paper with hands that no longer shook when his children spoke to him. "The Science Museum. This looks interesting." "Nathan wants to see the dinosaurs," Gabriel explained. "He's been reading about velociraptors." Theodore looked at Nathan, who smiled shyly and nodded. The same child who had refused to speak for 2 years was now devouring books about prehistoric creatures and sharing his discoveries with anyone who would listen. The school reports that arrived monthly painted a picture of transformation that even Theodore found hard to believe. Gabriel's teacher wrote, "I don't know what happened in your household, but Gabriel has become a natural leader instead of a disruptive influence." Daniel's grades had improved from failing to honor roll. Nathan was not only speaking in class but had been selected for the gifted and talented program. Lucas and Ethan were no longer getting in trouble for fighting and had joined the chess club together. But the most remarkable change had happened 3 weeks earlier, on the anniversary of Lydia's death. For 2 years, that date had been marked by Theodore's complete disappearance into his office and the boys' most destructive behavior of the year. Last year, they had broken every dish in the china cabinet and flooded the bathroom. The year before, They had destroyed Theodore's home office while he hid in a hotel downtown, unable to face the day his wife died. This year was different. This year, Isabella had suggested they honor Lydia's memory instead of hiding from it. They started the morning by visiting her grave together, carrying fresh flowers and the chicken and dumpling recipe they had learned to make in her honor. Gabriel placed a drawing he had made of their family, including Isabella, on the headstone. Daniel brought a book of poetry Lydia had loved, and read her favorite poem aloud. Nathan brought smooth stones he had collected from the garden, arranging them in a heart shape around the flowers. Theodore brought something he had never been able to leave before, a letter he had written to his wife, telling her about their son's accomplishments, their growth, their healing. Telling her that he was finally learning to be the father she had wanted him to be. They spent the afternoon cooking Lydia's recipes and sharing stories about her. Isabella encouraged the boys to ask questions about their mother, what she had liked to eat, what movies made her laugh, what songs she hummed while cooking. For the first time since her death, Lydia's name filled the house with warmth instead of sorrow. That evening, Theodore had made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "Isabella," he said after the boys had gone to bed, "I have something to ask you." Isabella looked up from where she was wiping down the kitchen counters, probably expecting a question about schedules or meal planning or disciplinary strategies. "I want you to stay," Theodore said simply. "Not as an employee, as family." Isabella's hands stilled on the dishcloth. "Theodore, I know it's not conventional," he continued. "I know it's complicated. But you've become more than just someone who works in our house. You've become the person who helped us learn to live again. The boys need you. I need you. Not romantically," he added quickly, "but as someone who helped us build a new kind of family structure." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, processing what he was offering. A permanent place in a family that had learned to heal because she had shown them how. "Are you asking me to adopt them?" she asked carefully. "I'm asking you to be their family," Theodore said. "In whatever way feels right to all of us. I'm asking you to help me raise them. I'm asking you to stay not because we can't survive without you, but because we don't want to." This transformation didn't happen overnight. It took 6 months of consistent love, daily boundary setting, and choosing presence over perfection. Just like these stories take months to research, weeks to write, and careful attention to every emotional detail. If content that shows real healing instead of quick fixes matters to you, show us by subscribing. Isabella said yes. 2 weeks later, a new cook arrived for her first day at the Ashford mansion. Maria Santos was experienced, well recommended, and nervous about the stories she had heard regarding the Ashford children's treatment of kitchen staff. What she found instead was 5-6-year-old boys who immediately introduced themselves politely, offered to show her where everything was stored, and asked if she would like to learn their mother's chicken and dumpling recipe. "We used to be really mean to cooks," Gabriel explained matter-of-factly while helping Maria arrange ingredients on the counter. "But that was because we were sad and didn't know how to say so. Now we know better. Isabella taught us that hurting people doesn't make our own hurt go away," Daniel added, carefully measuring flour into a bowl. "And Dad taught us that missing Mom doesn't mean we can't love other people too," Nathan said quietly, his voice strong and clear. The kitchen was still messy. The boys still tested boundaries occasionally. Theodore still had moments where grief overwhelmed his ability to parent perfectly. But now they faced those challenges together, as a family that had learned the difference between surviving trauma and healing through it. How did a family that couldn't eat together learn to cook together? What does healthy grief look like in a home that once avoided all memories? The answer was written in flour-dusted countertops and children's laughter echoing through hallways that had once known only silence. It was visible in family photos that now included Isabella without awkwardness, displayed next to Lydia's portrait with fresh flowers beneath both frames. It was audible in bedtime stories that mentioned both the mother who was gone and the love that remained. True healing doesn't erase the past. It integrates loss with the possibility of new love. It proves that broken families can rebuild stronger foundations. Comment, family, if you believe that love doesn't end with death, it just learns to exist in new forms. Share this story if you know someone who needs to see that healing is possible, even after the worst kind of loss. Subscribe because every family deserves stories that show them how to love through grief instead of hiding from it. The Ashford family had learned that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the ashes of what was lost. Isabella Romano didn't save the Ashford family by being perfect, she saved them by being present. The kitchen still gets messy when they cook together. The boys still test boundaries when they're processing big emotions. Theodore still struggles with balancing board meetings and bedtime stories. But now they struggle together, as a family that has learned the difference between surviving pain and healing through it. Gabriel still has nightmares sometimes, but now his father sits with him instead of hiding from his grief. Daniel still gets protective over his mother's memory, but now he shares stories instead of hoarding them. Nathan still chooses his words carefully, but now he uses his voice to build bridges instead of maintaining walls. Lucas and Ethan still cause chaos, but now it's the beautiful chaos of children who feel safe enough to be children. Isabella Romano saw 5 heartbroken little boys when everyone else saw 5 behavioral problems. She stayed when others fled. She held boundaries when others gave up. That's the kind of love that changes lives. That's the kind of story that changes perspectives. These aren't just entertaining tales, they're mirrors reflecting the courage and resilience inside all of us. This story is one thread in our SoulThread Stories collection. Every story in this collection is designed to see your pain, reflect your strength, and remind you that healing is possible. If you want access to our complete collection of transformational stories, drop SoulThread in the comments. Because everyone deserves stories that heal instead of just entertain. Subscribe now, not just for more content, but for more stories that matter.